our modern idea of Merlin as a kindly old man, a sort of Dumbledore or Gandalf type, as it were, doesn't convey many of the more disturbing aspects of Merlin's character as he appears in medieval literature. Those particular aspects that evoke the devil side of Merlin.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander F., and today we are esoterically elated to chat about Merlin, myth, and manuscripts with Dr. Laura Campbell. A few years ago, fragments of a medieval manuscript telling the story of Merlin were rediscovered in the United Kingdom in a Bristol archive. These fragments are nearly 800 years old, and they contain variations on the Arthurian legend and the lore surrounding the legendary wizard Merlin. So you might ask, why is this new manuscript so important? Who is Merlin in the legend of King Arthur? What was Merlin's genesis with real and mythological source material? What is the account of Merlin's sexual encounter with the enchantress Vivienne, also known as the Lady of the Lake? Also, what are the biggest misconceptions about Merlin? Well, get ready, listeners, because our guest today, Dr. Laura Campbell, is the perfect person to ask. Dr. Campbell was part of that team of experts who translated and contextualized this Merlin manuscript fragment. Dr. Campbell is Assistant Professor of Translation Studies and French in the School of Modern Languages and Cultures at Durham University. She co-wrote a book about her involvement with the Bristol Merlin fragment entitled The Bristol Merlin Revealing the Secrets of a Medieval Fragment. And in 2017, Dr. Campbell also published The Medieval Merlin Tradition in France and Italy, Prophecy, Paradox, and Translatio. Dr. Campbell explores deeply about the figure of Merlin and how the process of medieval translations of Merlin affected the wizard's character in French and Italian Arthurian literature. In this podcast, Dr. Campbell shares more about this half-human, half-devil, contradictory, and enigmatic character known as Merlin. She also shares about the significance of the Bristol fragment and the multifaceted aspects of Merlin. Also, I want to give a huge thank you to each and every Glitch Bottle patron on Patreon for your support of the podcast. Without you, it wouldn't be possible, and for your excellent questions for Dr. Campbell. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, let's welcome Dr. Laura Campbell. Dr. Laura Campbell, thank you so much just for taking the time and stopping on the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Before we get to Merlin, who, as you write about, Dr. Campbell, is this intriguing, enigmatic, half-human, half-devil character, can you take us back a bit, Dr. Campbell, and just share a little bit about how did you first become interested in Merlin, and how did you first become interested in early modern studies?
I was always really interested in the medieval literary modules. And I remember the first medieval French text I read, Guigemard by Marie de France. And I just remember being really fascinated by the language. I'd never seen medieval French before, and it was close enough to modern French that you could kind of make it out, but it was like kind of solving a puzzle, going through and trying to decipher each of the lines. And I just found that fascinating. So I ended up staying on to do a PhD at Durham, the same place I studied. And I wanted to look at the translation of Arthurian material into Italian. So I initially started off being interested in translation. Merlin kind of came later. The obvious project would have been looking at the translation of the Tristan stories, because Tristan is like the big character in medieval Arthurian Italian literature. But someone was already doing a PhD on that, apparently. So I looked around and see what else hadn't been studied. And I found all these Merlin texts that were a little bit different. They weren't conventional romances, and there was really very little literature on them. So I just decided to study them. And it turned out to be really, really interesting, especially the way in which prophecy and the practice of translation intersected with each other, as well as the Italian cultural interpretation of Merlin.
Who is Merlin? Can you give us just the broad strokes about this fascinating character?
So Merlin is a popular character in medieval literature. He's associated with the Arthurian legend and stories related to that. In some romances, he's the protagonist in his own right. In others, he's just a peripheral character who appears briefly. I can talk more about the origins in a bit, but the main wave of Merlin stories came about in the early 13th century in France, and they were translated into English, German, Italian, Hebrew. He became a well-known figure throughout Western Europe. And although his characteristics and his narrative arc can vary from version to version, generally in the medieval stories, Merlin is a human-demon hybrid who has certain magical powers and the gift of prophecy. In some stories, he's associated with the Holy Grail. It's his job to make sure that King Arthur becomes king and defeats his enemies so that the Grail quest can take place later on. So he's often dabbling in the politics of the story. He's helping the rightful kings to take their place. But because his father was a devil, he's also a bit of a kind of morally ambiguous figure. He's a bit of a trickster figure. He gets himself into trouble quite a lot for revealing inconvenient truths. He has complicated relationships with women. And he often likes to withdraw frequently from human society. So even though he's often right in the center of court politics, sometimes he just needs to take time out, and he goes off to the woods where his hermit friend Blaise lives. And when he's in the woods with Blaise, he often tells him everything that's happening. And also he knows the future, so he tells him things that are going to happen. And Blaise writes them down in his book. And this book is often cited as the source for the Arthurian story. So a lot of people have pointed out that Merlin, in many ways, is also the author of the Arthurian story, because he's writing the text. He's dictating it to be composed as the action is happening.
You mentioned Merlin's father was a demon. Any particular demon is named here, or is there just kind of a general infernal suggestion of some kind of parentage that is demonic?
So it isn't any particular demon. The context for Merlin's devil parentage is this originates in a story from the early 13th century, possibly by the French writer Robert de Boron. And the text starts off in hell. And it takes place immediately after the harrowing of hell, which was a kind of apocryphal story about how during the time between when Christ was crucified and when he resurrected, he went to hell and freed all the people who'd been born before Christianity, so they'd all just gone automatically to hell. So the devils are really annoyed about this, and they want to get back at God. So in order to get their revenge, they decide to conceive an antichrist. And this is essentially what they're planning is an inverse Jesus. Just as God is the father of Christ, the devil would be the father of this antichrist. So they select a woman who they decide is going to be the mother of Merlin, and they persecute her, and they persecute her family so much that she becomes really miserable. And she's open to this kind of diabolical intervention. So the devil sleeps with her while she's asleep, and she conceives Merlin. So Merlin, he's half devil in that case. He inherits powers deriving from his devil father. And these are usually consistent with what people in the Middle Ages thought that devils could do. So they thought devils could change shape, they could create illusions, manipulate natural laws. In some they can summon other devils. And these are all things that Merlin can do in the text. However, Merlin's main power is that he's omniscient. So people believe that devils had a knowledge of everything in the past and everything in the present, but not everything in the future. That realm belonged to God. However, the reason that Merlin isn't fully evil and that he isn't fully a devil is that when he was born, God was onto the devils. He knew what they were planning. So he decides to save Merlin's soul. And in doing so, he gives Merlin the additional gift of prophecy. So now Merlin knows everything. He knows everything in the past, everything that's going on in the present, and everything in the future as well. So different texts interpret this kind of balance between his kind of divine gift of prophecy and his diabolical side and his devil powers in different ways. In some texts, he's kind of more devil than human. In some texts, he's more of a kind of like divinely inspired character with just a little hint of devil.
We do have a listener question for you, Dr. Campbell, from Amelia Passer, who's asking, "Hi, Dr. Campbell. I'm wondering what you feel are the main symbols associated with Merlin, and please give a commentary on what each one represents."
Hi, Amelia, and thank you very much for your question. So the medieval Merlin isn't really associated with any of the objects we associate with him in modern times. He doesn't have a wand. He doesn't have a pointy hat. I would say the object that's most commonly associated with him in the vernacular stories, vernacular is a word I'll probably be dropping in quite a lot. In medieval context, it means not in Latin, so in French, English, Italian. So in the vernacular stories, the object that's most associated with him is the book that we've already talked about, the book that he composes. In medieval manuscripts, the standard image of Merlin that you see repeated a lot is this image of Merlin standing and gesticulating as if he's talking next to the scribe, Blaise, his hermit friend, who is seated at a desk and writing down what he says. So this is the image of Merlin composing the book that would be the source for the stories that we're reading. And the fact that this image was regularly depicted shows that it's an aspect of his character that medieval readers strongly associated with him. And the book, of course, represents Merlin's role as a quasi-authorial figure within the text. It reminds us that Merlin is writing the book from within the book, and it kind of bolsters the veracity of the text by dramatizing the composition of its source as the action is happening. But it also points to Merlin's authority as well. Books in the Middle Ages, they were luxury items. Not everyone could own books. Not everyone was literate enough to read them. So books were associated with clerics, academics, priests, people who had access to education. And so Merlin's prophetic and authorial role in the story, as well as his vast omniscient knowledge, would have certainly evoked the figure of the cleric for medieval readers. And this, interestingly, also differentiates him from other men in the stories, who are usually exclusively knights and kings. So this association with the book shows that he represents a different form of masculinity, one that articulates itself through intelligence and knowledge rather than through action or violence.
Where was Merlin first mentioned in literature? Can you give us a few more details?
The earliest references to Merlin that we have are from early Welsh poetry, where a figure called Merlin is a Cumbrian prince who was so traumatized by battle that he went mad and he became a prophet. He became a kind of trickster figure who was a disruptive presence in the court and like a wild man who went and lived in the woods. So there's various poems where we have little mentions of Merlin, but they're all quite fragmentary, and we don't really know the origins of that. These are early poems, but the manuscripts we have are a lot later. It was Geoffrey of Monmouth, a Welsh historian who was writing in the 12th century, however, who first incorporated Merlin into the story of King Arthur, even though in his text, Merlin actually appears a whole generation before Arthur. And in Geoffrey's chronicle, the Historia Regum Britanniae, he combines Merlin with another figure from a Welsh chronicle by Nennius, called Ambrosius. And this Ambrosius is an advisor to King Vortigern, who's apparently this young boy. He's like a kind of child prodigy who advises the king. So in Geoffrey's Historia Regum Britanniae, Merlin is a sort of a weird child who advises the king, called Ambrosius Merlinus. So he combines the Mervyn from the Welsh poems with this figure of Ambrosius. And it's Geoffrey who tells us that Ambrosius Merlinus is the apparent son of a devil who has prophetic powers. So he advises Kings Vortigern and Uther on several matters, and he also pronounces several prophecies as well. Geoffrey also wrote a separate poem called the Vita Merlini, in which he tells the story of Merlin, which is more like the figure of Mervyn in the Welsh poems. So this is a totally different Merlin, even by the same author. And in this version, as in the Welsh poems, Merlin is a prince who went mad after a battle and lived as a wild man in the woods. And from this kind of traumatic event, he gains a supernatural knowledge and becomes a disruptive presence in the court. So French vernacular writers would then later combine these figures, the Merlinus Ambrosius, the king's advisor, and Mervyn, the sort of mad, traumatized prophet who lives in the woods. French vernacular writers would combine them into one single figure who would be the basis for all these vernacular stories of Merlin. And we suspect that the consonant shift, because of course Mervyn in Welsh is spelt with a double D, it's that the sound. In Geoffrey's version, he started calling him Merlin or Merlinus. And we suspect this is because Merdinus would be translated into shit in Latin and in Old French. You got the word merde, which is the same word today. So we don't know exactly why, but we think that's why he's called Merlin and not Merdin, as he would have been in Welsh.
Can you share with us, Dr. Campbell, to that very point, about how Merlin is, as you say, quote, an omniscient prophet who consistently translates his vision of narrative into obscure prophecies? This is super fascinating. And I know for me, it was a facet of Merlin that I never really considered before. Can you just share about like what is going on here when Merlin does give a prophecy? What is the process of prophecy, if you will?
So this is something I argued in my first book, the idea that prophecy, as it was understood in the Middle Ages, was kind of a form of translation. So in order to contextualize this, basically you have to go back to medieval theology and St. Augustine, who argues that according to Christian theology, all of time and history is already predetermined. We're all running along a predetermined path. So for God, there's no distinction between the past, present, and future because he knows how all of history is going to pan out. And it was thought that God didn't experience time as human beings do on earth, as hours and minutes that unfold in a sequence. For him, all time is happening all the time right now. So this idea of the division of past, present, and future, according to Augustine, is just a symptom of human experience because humans are limited, as a result of original sin. We have limited minds and we can only perceive time as it happens in the present moment or as a sequence of hours and minutes that unfold. However, Merlin is omniscient. So he's like God in a way in that he can see everything. He can see all of history and time at once. Therefore, within the text, he can see the whole Arthurian story from start to finish. So when he prophesies about the future of the story to other characters in the text, he's essentially translating his omniscient knowledge into a human time frame where the present and the past and the future are all separated from each other. So essentially what I was arguing was this is like a translation between two languages, but instead it's a translation between two time frames or two ways of perceiving time. A translation of information from Merlin's omniscient mind into the human realm of time and language, where past, present, and future have to be separated from each other. And there's also a linguistic component to this as well, because in a lot of texts, Merlin's prophecies are phrased in very obscure and symbolic language. This comes about in Robert de Boron's text. It kind of sets the tradition of this in later vernacular texts, because there's an incident very early on in the text where a jealous baron keeps trying to expose Merlin as a fraud. And Merlin gets really annoyed with this and just says, okay, after this, no more direct prophecies. Everything I say now is going to be in obscure language and you're not going to be able to understand it. That's your fault. This is the kind of story that explains why Merlin speaks an obscure language. But more broadly, prophecy in medieval culture was already associated with the use of obscure symbolism. It was seen to be inherent in prophecy that it should be spoken in obscure terms. This ultimately comes from the biblical prophets, from the Sibylline prophecies. Listeners might also be familiar with later prophets like Nostradamus and Mother Shipton, who also spoke in these obscure terms, which can conveniently be interpreted in various ways. So I argue that in the Merlin text, though, Merlin's obscure prophecies are symptomatic of the fact that this translation of knowledge between his omniscient mind and the world of human time and human language is impossible. It's just not possible for human thought to accommodate Merlin's omniscience. So the obscurity of the language, which people in the text just really can't understand, it characterizes that inability of ordinary human beings to see the world as Merlin sees it. It exposes the limitations of human thought in relation to the omniscience of God and Merlin. But Merlin is also he's a gatekeeper of that knowledge, because even when people ask, will you tell us what you mean? He says no, he just refuses to tell people what his prophecies are about.
Can you share about this whole act of translation and Merlin and prophecy? What did that mean for the actual medieval translators? How did medieval translators themselves, when they're pouring through, as you say, these obscure texts or translating something from French into Italian or synthesizing Welsh poetry, how did they think about the process of translation and how it relates to Merlin and all of that?
For Italian translators of French material, it's actually questionable as to whether they would have thought of it as a translation at all, because actually lots of writers in Italy at the time were just writing in French because French was the language associated with prose, Arthurian romance. And it was just the standard thing to just write those texts in French. And a lot of Italian readers could read French, especially North Italian dialects were not too dissimilar from Southern French dialects. So it's kind of difficult to think about a translation from a theoretical perspective. Often these authors would just be either copying the text or writing their own version in a different language. So it's possible that they didn't really think of it as a translation at all. But in the Middle Ages, the concept of translation was quite different anyway. They tended to think of translation as something that you did between Latin and the vernaculars, because there was a very clear distinction there that was cultural and linguistic. And nowadays, when we think of translation, we tend to think of it as being something that's purely linguistic. You know, we translate from one language to another in a sort of utilitarian sense. The modern concept of translation in the Middle Ages was encompassed by a Latin rhetorical term, translatio, which literally meant to just move over in a physical sense. And this term translatio covered a lot of different things. It covered translation between languages, also any form of cultural transfer, but also a kind of a translation or a movement of anything. So the movement of knowledge or power or texts between different cultures. Even the movement of physical relics was characterized as a translatio. So it was a kind of, they thought of translation as a moving over that encompassed language, but was not restricted to it. So when we look at this from the perspective of the translation that Merlin is doing between his omniscient knowledge and human earthly time and language, Merlin's translating between the spiritual and the earthly, between the immaterial and the material when he prophesies. He's converting this omniscient knowledge into human timeframes, thought, and language. So from the perspective of translatio, we can see that as a form of translation, which is partially linguistic, but also partially metaphysical as well.
Can you share with the listeners who might not be too familiar with these terms, what are modern semiotic theory and language philosophy, and how do you use these to examine the process of translation itself when you're going through this extensive research and contextualization?
So semiotic theory, basically it's the science of how signs are understood, not just linguistic signs, but any sort of signs. So it's the way in which we think about how we interpret, basically, how we interpret language. And in the book, I was drawing on theories of how language and interpretation work in order to frame my arguments about how translation is functioning in these medieval vernacular contexts, that is, between vernacular languages, specifically French and Italian. So the reason why I kind of needed a different framework was that when you study modern translation, you have an original text, the source text, and a translation. And that's, not to play down the complexity of the process of modern translation, but you're at least working with two relatively stable texts that you can identify. And you have a fair idea of what was there in the original and what the translator has done differently. But in the Middle Ages, however, this was extremely complicated because of manuscript circulation. Every manuscript we have is ever so slightly different. There are lots of different versions of each of these texts that I'm talking about. We have no idea often which version of the text was the source text used for translations, whether there's versions, intermediary versions that have since been lost. When you're working with medieval manuscripts, you're always working with a potentially impartial corpus. We don't know which texts have survived and which ones have been lost. So you have to approach this idea of a source text and a translation quite differently in a way that accounts for that lack of certainty. So in my work, I was drawing on the work of the slightly obscure logician, Charles Sanders Peirce, and he argued that all forms of interpretation of signs was a form of accumulation of information, where we kind of accrete all the information we know about the sign. And I think of medieval translation in that sense as being not like a movement from one text to the next, but more like a snowball that kind of rolls around and gathers information and gets bigger and bigger. the development of Merlin as a character is an example of that. So we already talked about how Geoffrey of Monmouth's version took these different versions of Merlin from the Welsh poems, but also this figure of Ambrosius, and he combined them together. And then the medieval vernacular versions took those two versions of Merlin that Geoffrey talked about and combined them together again with other information about, they took this idea that Merlin's the son of a devil, and they combined, theological ideas about devils and what powers devils have. So each text is kind of like gathering all in an almost an encyclopedic way, gathering all the information they have at the time about Merlin and kind of rolling it into a big snowball. And then the next version kind of gathers more information. So that's how this kind of semiotic idea of accumulation frames how I think about medieval translation.
I love that imagery of a snowball. That is so fantastic. And, it's so funny, Dr. Campbell, because we often hear the phrase of something being lost in translation. But it seems what you're saying is when it comes to Merlin and the translation and moving from France to Italy, or, from Britain to France to Italy, that there's just a ton gained in translation as well. Would that be somewhat fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, there was no such thing as copyright in the Middle Ages. So translators had absolutely no obligation to translate in any sort of accurate way. Absolutely. I would say there's probably a lot more gained than lost. So the figure of Merlin, particularly looking at the context of the translation of Merlin from French to Italian, he develops a great deal when he moves around from text to text. So in Merlin's adoption in Italy, they really emphasized and built up his role as a prophet. So the first Italian adaptation that we have of a Merlin story is called Les Prophéties de Merlin. It was written in French. As I said, that's just the language of Arthurian romance in the 13th century, but it was written in Venice in around the sort of 1270s, so 50 years or so after the French Arthurian romances were written. So the author, basically, they wrote a kind of new Arthurian romance that revolved around Merlin, but they also included a whole new set of prophecies for him, many of which were actually related to contemporary Northern Italian history and events that had taken place in Italy in the 13th century. And Merlin in this text also, he didn't just prophesy about Italy, but he also talked about other Arthurian texts. And he talks a lot about the end of the world as well. So in doing so, they're taking the French Arthurian romances, in which Merlin is a purely fictional character, and he's talking only about things that happen in the Arthurian romances. But again, we've got this like snowball effect. They're also bringing in Geoffrey of Monmouth. And in Geoffrey's Latin Chronicle, the prophecies that Merlin makes in the Chronicle, they start off just talking about things that would happen later on in the text. But then they go right up to Geoffrey's present day. They talk about political events in Anglo-Norman England. Geoffrey's Chronicle was designed to bolster the authority of the Anglo-Norman aristocracy at the time. So there's a political importance to them as well. And what it does is it creates the illusion of true prophecy, because Merlin, of course, supposedly lived in the past in 5th century Britain. So even though these prophecies were talking about things that had recently happened, they were in the past, it gives the illusion that Merlin had prophesied about them, 500 years earlier. So the Italian texts take this idea and translate the context of the prophecies to contemporary Italy, while weaving in narrative elements from the French romances. So again, it's this accretion, this snowball effect. As always with the prophecies, the literal meaning of them are disguised by obscure symbolism, but there's enough information there that Italian readers probably would have known exactly who they were talking about. And the prophecies are especially critical of the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, who died in 1250, so about 20 years before, and the Prophétie de Merlin was written. And Merlin in this text claims that the Emperor Frederick was the Antichrist, and throughout he refers to him as the Dragon of Babylon. But he also criticizes the politics of the papacy, clerical corruption as well. He has a particular ideological position. So the Italian versions then, they use this motif of Merlin's omniscience to make political points about their own time, but they embed them within this broader timeline that starts in 5th century Arthurian Britain, that goes right through contemporary medieval Italy, all the way up to the apocalypse, which Merlin talks extensively about as well.
All of a sudden, in 2019, there is this Bristol fragment that's discovered. Can you just give the listeners some of the broad strokes about how, I believe it was the Guardian article that said, quote, "The 7 parchment fragments were found by chance in 2019, pasted into the bindings of 4 volumes from between 1494 and 1502 that are held in Bristol Central Library's rare books collection. That is just so wild to me that they were found by chance. Can you just share with us about what was going on just a couple of years ago when this was first rediscovered?
So there was actually a series of weird coincidences. So Michael Richardson, who's the librarian at Bristol Central Library, was looking through some Renaissance books that they have to use for an MA class on book history. And he looked in the binding of this, it was a 15th century book on French philosophy, opened it up, and he saw that the manuscript that had been used to bind it was actually in French. Now, often these manuscripts that are used to bind the books are in Latin. The thing is, with these Renaissance books, the paper was very, very delicate, and the cover of the book was made of wood and it was quite heavy. So in order to protect the delicate paper, they used bits of often old medieval manuscripts, because medieval manuscripts were made of calf skin. It's an extremely strong and durable material. So, and it was also expensive as well. So once the text is no longer being read, it still had continuing value as a piece of durable material. So they would often paste down bits of old medieval manuscripts into the front of the book to protect the paper. And these are usually Latin liturgical texts, which are frankly 10 a penny. You can find them anywhere. But it's not usual that they're in French. So he had a look through it and he noticed the words Arthur and Merlin. So he got in touch with Professor Leah Tether in the English department, who was then the president of the British branch of the International Arthurian Society, who happens to be a friend and longtime collaborator of mine as well. We've worked together quite a lot. So Leah got in touch with me and we had a look at this text, identified it as a part of the Vulgate Cycle. And it was quite coincidental because Leah and Benjamin Pole both had research grants to come and work in Durham the following month. So they were already coming up here. So it actually gave us a chance to work on it together, which was a bit of a coincidence. And also it turns out that this Renaissance book had actually come from Durham to Bristol. So there was already that strange Durham connection. And the fact that it had been found in the library where the president of the Arthurian Society happened to be working, it was just really interesting and just a really nice surprise.
As you mentioned, Dr. Campbell, here you are, and you're collaborating with Professor Leah Tether, medieval historian and manuscript specialist, Dr. Benjamin Pole. And as you're going through this, as you mentioned, you were able to pinpoint this being part of the text known as the Vulgate Cycle or the Lancelot Grail Cycle. Can you share with the listeners, what is this cycle and what does it tell us about the specific context and the dating of the manuscript as well?
So the Vulgate Cycle is probably the most significant medieval work on King Arthur. It's an enormous cycle of romances written in French in prose, telling the story of King Arthur. And it was composed between 1215 and 1230. So it began initially with the story of Lancelot in prose. And then it just kind of expanded out from there by the addition of prequels and sequels. The final cycle begins with the origins of the Holy Grail at Christ's crucifixion and the journey of the Grail to Britain. And it goes right up to the death of Arthur and the sort of collapse of Arthur's kingdom. So the story of Merlin is the second branch of the story. And it narrates the birth of Merlin, the birth of Arthur, Arthur's early reign, where he's guided by Merlin to secure his position as a king and defeat his many enemies. And then Merlin's incarceration by the Lady of the Lake in a magic tower, which is when Merlin then disappears from the story and it continues without him. So this fragment, we think, was written in northeastern France around 1250, between 1250 and 1275, which is a pretty early example. It's only a generation or so after the text's initial composition. And we can tell from annotations in English in the margin that it had reached England by the early 14th century, a period, of course, in which French was still being read. And there was a great deal of exchange of texts between literary centres like Paris and Oxford.
Can you share a little bit more about this amazing interdisciplinary collaboration? Because when you were working with Dr. Leah Tether and Dr. Benjamin Pole, I think when people read an article about the Bristol fragment, we just see the end result, this amazing work, but there was a ton of interdisciplinary collaboration. Can you just share a little bit more about that?
Yes, of course. So the collaboration came really from the impetus to see the fragment not simply as a text, but as a material object that can speak to us in a variety of ways through its history, its annotations, its ink, its use as a waste material. All of these things together combined with the text and the language are telling us a coherent story about the life of this manuscript and the way in which the text was read and used. So in order to view the fragment in this completely holistic sense, it required a collaborative effort between scholars with different specialisms and different skills. So, personally, I know about the text itself. I can analyze the language and its provenance. I translated it. I can identify the redaction, but I can't date the handwriting or identify the type of ink or tell you, these are things that required the expertise of Benjamin Pohl. So at the same time, this was combined with the expertise of Leah Tether, who is a book historian, and she was able to research and trace the book's history and identify the probable route it took from France to, we think, Oxford, to Durham, to Bristol. And we also took advantage as well as the work of Andy Beebe, who's a professor of chemistry at Durham, who's designed a machine for multispectral imaging. And this is kind of cutting edge technology that's helped us to read some of the damaged parts of the text. So the resulting book was the result of this combination of all our respective work on the fragment from our different disciplinary perspectives, which I hope produces more than the sum of its parts.
We have a ton of listener questions for you, including a listener question for you from Maria. And Maria is asking and saying, I am so excited Dr. Campbell is coming on the podcast, and I really appreciate her work. My question, Maria says, is, overall, Dr. Campbell, what do the Bristol fragments contain, and how difficult was it to work through the fragments compared to perhaps other manuscripts or other texts or other fragments that you've worked with?
Hi, Maria, and thank you so much for your question. The fragment contains a section of 8 folios, which, when typed up in a modern edition, came out as around 30 pages. And it contains a section, as you know, from the Vulgate Cycle. The part of the story that the fragment contains is a section called the Battle of Trèbes, which is where Arthur defeats the army of the evil French king Claudas de la Déserte, followed by a section where Merlin interprets a prophetic dream by Lancelot's future mother, Queen Elaine. She has this dream about Lancelot, who obviously isn't born yet. And then Merlin visits Vivienne, who might be more well known to listeners as Nimue, or the Lady of the Lake, and he teaches her his magic. So the real difficulty of working through this was just how damaged the fragment was in parts. As I'd mentioned, these pages were glued down to protect the paper, but when the page had been pulled away from the front of the printed book, the glue had removed large parts of the text. Some of the text was visible, some not. The multispectral imaging helped us to reveal some parts of the letters that had been damaged by the glue, and they allowed us to see enough, in some cases, of the letters to work out what the word was. But there are also large chunks of the text as well that were just completely irretrievable. Not to mention one page that was just practically ripped in half. Nothing we can do about that. So where the text was gone, what we had to do was supply text for the edition from the extant manuscript that had the text that was closest to ours. Of course, bearing in mind that every manuscript of a text will contain a slightly different version of it. Each scribe makes their own edits. They have sentences that are verbally different from each other, but saying roughly the same thing. They use synonyms, dialectal variants, that sort of thing. So a lot of the time, the text was close enough to our control manuscript, called BNF 344. It was close enough that we could, just insert the text of this other manuscript. But in some cases, it was clear from the part of the word that we could see that the sentence did diverge considerably from the control text. So we couldn't always mash them together quite as coherently as we'd like. So if anyone actually does read the edition, you'll see that part of the text is in italics. And this is the parts that was supplied by this control manuscript, which was a manuscript from Eastern France. It's heavily inflected with a Lotharingian dialect from that region. So you'll see in the French text that it does look quite different visually as well. But the actual way it's worded is, in most cases, more or less the same.
To that point, Dr. Campbell, we do have another listener question for you from Stephen Sivadelic, who is asking, Dr. Campbell, my question surrounds the character of Morgana le Fay, the archetypical sorceress who has always fascinated me, especially her magical feats, as written about in, please forgive my horrible American pronunciation, Le Mort d'Arthur. Is Arthur's half-sister or her magic mentioned in this new manuscript? And if so, is there any interaction between her and Merlin or any other characters like Nimue, Vivienne, etc.?
Hi, Stephen, and thank you again for your question. I'm afraid Morgan doesn't actually come up in this particular fragment, although she is in the text. Incidentally, if you're interested in Morgan, you should check out the Prophétie de Merlin. It's an obscure text, it's not very well known, but Morgan plays quite a significant role in that. There's lots of interaction between her and the Lady of the Lake and another enchantress called Sibylle, and they have this kind of fun rivalry going on where they're always trying to outdo each other. But back to this fragment, sadly, there's no Morgan, but we do have an appearance by Nimue, or Vivienne, as she's called here in the French. In this part of the text, she's a young woman who Merlin has fallen in love with, and he kind of keeps visiting her home at regular intervals. And she takes advantage of his affections to get him to teach her magic. In this particular part of the story that appears in the fragment, she asks him how to make somebody fall asleep without them realizing. And she claims she wants to know so she can make her father go to sleep every time Merlin comes round, so her dad doesn't know that she's hanging out with Merlin. No one wants their daughter hanging out with the son of a devil. But Merlin knows exactly why she wants to know this. You know, she wants to make him fall asleep so she can trap him in a magic tower. At the end of the text, he is omniscient, but he just loves her so much, he can't help himself, so he teaches her the spell.
Can you share in terms of the encounter of Merlin and Vivienne that in this text, there might be a ring that's employed, whereas other texts, things might be bound around Vivienne's thigh, I believe. Can you just share a little bit more about just these encounters and these differences between the Bristol fragment and other tales of Merlin?
So there are numerous versions of this story of the relationship between Merlin and Vivienne, who will eventually become the Lady of the Lake. And ultimately, the character comes from the Lancelot branch of the Vulgate Cycle. So the Lady of the Lake is the fairy foster mother who steals Lancelot when he's a baby and raises him in a magic palace under a lake. And there it explains that she got her powers by seducing Merlin and getting him to teach her magic, which she eventually uses to get rid of him by trapping him in a cave. Now, the Lancelot story was written first, and the Merlin story, which immediately precedes it, was written as a prequel afterwards. So it kind of riffs on this story. But of course, in this version, Merlin's the main character. They don't want him to be bad like he is in the Lancelot story, where, you know, he's a bit of a pest, really, and the Lady of Lake's trying to just get rid of him. Here, Vivienne is actually the bad guy. She's much more manipulative and scheming than in the Lancelot, where she's a positive figure. She has to be because she's Lancelot's foster mother. So in this version, it's her who exploits him to try and get him to teach her magic. And, you know, so she eventually traps him in this magic castle where she kind of confines him forever. And there are lots of different versions of this story in different Merlin texts, some of which, you know, is in the Italian Prophétie de Merlin. Merlin is much more of a sexual predator who has, you know, he has this little harem of female students who he's teaching magic to, but he's also seducing them as well. But in the Vulgate Cycle, it emphasizes that Merlin never tried to sleep with Vivienne. He always has chaste intentions. However, she's afraid of him because she knows his father is a devil, and she knows what the devil did to his mother. So in the section of the text covered by the fragment, she casts a spell that will protect her from being raped by Merlin, possibly. And she does this by writing 3 magical words. It doesn't tell us what the words are. And she writes them on her groin, which is a clear metaphor for her genitals. And these words, when they're written on her, prevent any man from having sex with her. So in our fragment, it combines various variations that seem to tone down the sexual implications. So, as I've said, every manuscript, they always have like little bits that have been changed. And there are several ones where they tone down the odd thing, but our manuscript seems to have all the toning down going on. So in our fragment, the text replaces groin, which is N in Old French, with the phonetically similar word anel, which means ring, and jaisir, which is to have sex with someone, to parler, to speak with her. So whereas in a lot of versions, she writes the words on her groin so he can't sleep with her, in this version, she writes the words on a ring so he can't speak to her. So it kind of tones down the explicit sexual references. We don't know why. It could just be that this is the text as it appeared in the exemplar from which this was copied. It could be a deliberate decision by the scribe. It's impossible to know. But it's a good example of the sort of minor changes you get in manuscripts all the time. You know, sometimes they don't make any impact on the text at all. In this case, just changing a few words actually makes a bit of a change to the tone of the story.
You mentioned earlier as well, Dr. Campbell, that, part of this interdisciplinary team, looking at, as you mentioned, the context, the translation, and also even looking at the ink. And as you touched on, the Bristol fragments were written with a specific kind of carbon-based ink called lamp black that I know many listeners might be familiar with in their grimoire readings. And this lamp black was used instead of the iron gall ink, since the text appeared dark under infrared light. Can you share just anything more about the specific ink that was used for the manuscript?
Yes, of course. Well, I mean, this is more Dr. Pohl's area than mine, but I'll do my best. So in the Middle Ages, as your listeners probably know from their interest in grimoire, ink wasn't available to buy. Scribes had to make it themselves. And they usually did that by mixing together ground up gall nuts and iron salts. So this produced the ink called iron gall. And that was a very durable ink because it bound chemically to the calf skin on the manuscript page. This is the reason we can read manuscripts hundreds of years later. You could probably chuck a manuscript in a river and the ink would probably stay on. Even though there's sometimes some fading, it's a very durable kind of ink. This manuscript, however, uses a different type of ink mixed with soot instead of gall nuts, and that's what we call lamp black. It was less commonly used at the time, probably because it was a lot less durable, and it doesn't bind as well with the calf skin, and over time it just tends to flake off. And that's why parts of the text haven't survived being glued down in the Renaissance book. We're not sure why they used it for this particular manuscript, possibly to save money. It was certainly cheaper to mix ink with soot than to use the ingredients for iron gall ink. All those ingredients just might not have been available at the time for some reason, and they just had to improvise.
That is really interesting context around the ink. And kind of a broader question for you from listener Adley Nichols is, Dr. Campbell, for hundreds of years, magicians and practitioners of magical operations found in grimoires drew upon the mythos and the name of Solomon. Can you share about who or what groups or formal organizations might have also drawn upon the Merlin mythos or the Merlin name in a similar fashion at all?
Hi, Adley, and thank you for your question. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of any practitioners of magic who drew on the name of Merlin, although that doesn't mean there weren't any. Certainly there may have been in later periods. But in my experience, I would say Merlin is more well known in the Middle Ages anyway as a prophet rather than a magician, and this continues well into early modern times. There were groups who were interested in prophecy, who collected and shared them, and for whom Merlin was an important figure. So one of the Italian Merlin stories, which was printed in Venice in 1480, it says in the colophon that the edition was based on a book owned by someone called Pietro Delfino. And this Pietro Delfino is a real person we can trace. He was a theologian and an abbot of a monastery on the island of Murano in Venice. And we have letters of his that have survived. And they show that he was corresponding with an intellectual circle in Venice who were particularly interested in the prophecies of Joachim de Fiore, who was an Italian abbot whose writings were thought to be prophetic, as well as prophecies by Merlin and the Sibyl and other kind of well-known prophets. So Merlin's prophecies weren't just confined to these fictional Arthurian texts. We also have other prophecies written in Latin that were being circulated and included in chronicles that are attributed to Merlin. Again, these are often political, they're often associated with the Emperor Frederick II. And it's thought that these prophecies were, as in the stories, written after major events and then backdated by attributing them to a famous prophet in the past. These learned societies collected and shared these prophecies by Merlin and the Sibyl, and other prophecies that were also wrongly attributed to Joachim de Fiore as well. So I would say that's more his role in these societies and organizations as a prophet rather than a magician.
When you were looking at the Bristol fragments, what were some of the biggest surprises that you came across, or something that really stuck out to you that seemed to have just come out of nowhere? Any surprises at all?
So the marginal notes, I think, were very interesting because they tell us a lot about the history of the manuscript as an object. They suggest the use of the manuscript as an exemplar for use in a bookshop or maybe a printer's workshop. There's a note that says recensere parati in Latin, which means ready to be reviewed. So this suggests that somebody was, working through this and making editorial interventions, which is something they did in print shops. Of course, with the advent of printing and the emergence of print shops, often they would use old medieval manuscripts as sources for their texts, but they also edited them and adapted the text so it fit better into a printed form. So we have this marginal note. We also have little marks that suggest paragraph breaks. Again, this is a sort of thing a printer shop might have put in to show where they want the typesetters to start a new paragraph. We've also have parts where the text was damaged in the Middle Ages. There was like little holes or blobs of ink that would have been there from the beginning. And the words that are missing have been supplied either through guesswork or from another manuscript. So this perhaps suggests that the text was being used as an exemplar in a shop. And of course, that makes perfect sense when you look at how it ended up, right? Because if this text was being used as an exemplar in a printer's shop, and then once they stopped printing that particular text and the manuscript was no longer needed as an exemplar, then it would have been thrown in the waste paper pile or waste parchment pile more properly, and then could have been torn up and used to bind another book later on. So yeah, I think the marginal notes are very interesting in that respect.
Dr. Campbell, as well, we have a listener question for you from Kevin Carlo, who is asking, Dr. Campbell, this is such a broad question, but why do you think the Merlin figure has such staying power? I'm thinking of Gandalf, Obi-Wan Kenobi as two obvious stand-ins. And do you think there is a trickster element to Merlin that gets lost with modern interpretation?
That's a great question, Kevin. Thank you. So I think the reason that Merlin as a character has so much staying power is perhaps because the essential narrative of the Arthurian story, the story of a fatherless protagonist with obscure family origins who goes on to have a great destiny, is a very pervasive one that we see over and over again. It's the story of Luke Skywalker, Harry Potter in modern times. It goes right back to Moses in the Bible, and even Jesus Christ to an extent, to all appearances, is a fatherless child. So what brought Merlin to that story and what stuck there was this idea of an older mentor figure, a sort of fairy godfather, essentially, who stands in for this absent father to guide the young protagonist, and whose authority to do so comes from their supernatural power, as opposed to biological fatherhood. And we have loads of examples of this, from Dumbledore to Gandalf to Obi-Wan Kenobi, as you mentioned. But our modern idea of Merlin as a kindly old man, a sort of Dumbledore or Gandalf type, as it were, as Kevin points out, doesn't convey many of the more disturbing aspects of Merlin's character as he appears in medieval literature, those particular aspects that evoke the devil side of Merlin. So for a start, Merlin in the medieval texts, as I mentioned before, he could change shape to look like anybody he wanted to, but the descriptions of his usual form usually describe him as being dark and hairy. And his hairiness alludes to the fact that he's half devil, because devils in the Middle Ages were depicted as animal-like creatures. So he wasn't an old man with a little kind of wizard's hat. He could be anyone. Sometimes he appears as an old man, but his usual form is this kind of slightly devilishly hairy-looking man. He was quite sexually ambiguous, which is, again, as I've mentioned, the subject of contention among different authors. In some texts, like in the Italian texts, he can be a little bit of a creep around women. In other texts, he's more respectful. And as Kevin mentioned, he's a bit of a trickster figure. He sometimes just messes with people for the hell of it. He uses his shape-shifting abilities to play jokes on people. There's a whole motif of Merlin's laughter, which ultimately comes from Geoffrey of Monmouth, where Merlin sometimes just starts randomly laughing at something because he can perceive an absurd truth of a situation that no one else can see. So one time he just starts laughing at a beggar and everyone's like, why would you laugh at a beggar? And he says, well, because the beggar is sat on a big pile of treasure that's buried underneath him and he doesn't know anything about it. Not that he actually tells the beggar about it, but of course. So it's this idea of Merlin can see these absurd things that no one else can, and he finds them funny. In one French text, he nearly gets beaten up by woodsmen in the forest because he just randomly goes up to them and tells them how they're going to die, and they get annoyed and chase him. So sometimes he just like messes with people for no particular reason. And of course, that's the devil in him.
What are 2 or 3 things, Dr. Campbell, that readers of Arthurian literature or other literature should always keep in mind about the figure of Merlin? What are some core things that maybe with your students, with casual readers, that you really just want to be first and foremost when people are approaching these texts?
I mean, I guess I'd say an important thing is that he keeps changing. Literally, he keeps changing shape, but also as a character, he's changed a great deal over time. And I would say out of all the medieval characters, out of all the Arthurian characters, he's the one who's probably undergone the most radical set of reinterpretations, the one who probably least resembles his medieval version in his modern form. So there's a lot of plasticity to his character, figuratively, but also literally as well. He is a literal shapeshifter, which is kind of emblematic of the way in which he changes a great deal. He's also quite an underrated comic character. He's got an incredibly dark sense of humor. As I say, he laughs at absurd things like the beggar sitting on the treasure. He thinks it's funny to tell people when they're going to die. He jokes around with powerful kings by changing shape and pretending to be someone else he isn't. So the devil side of him, it makes him morally dubious, of course, even in texts when he doesn't do anything bad, but it also makes him fun as well. And this evokes the way that images of devils in the Middle Ages, as much as they were meant to depict something terrifying, they were also pretty funny. They were these playful pictures of Muppet-like creatures. Some of them were even quite cute. So there's a ludic element to devils in the Middle Ages, something kind of playful and almost silly, which I think also comes off in Merlin to an extent as well.
So given all that, what are some of the big misconceptions about Merlin that you are finding you always have to constantly maybe gently remind people or have people look into? For example, based on our conversation, I think I'd be safe in saying Merlin is not a Dumbledore-like character. Merlin has these deep mercurial and trickster aspects. Are there any other big misconceptions that people might have about Merlin?
I mean, I guess the one I come across most often is the idea that Merlin was a real historical person. I understand why people are very invested in the reality of characters like Arthur and Merlin, but I mean, of course, in the periods in which we have the first written evidence, it's very difficult to distinguish folklore from historical writing. So we have absolutely no concrete evidence at all to suggest that this Merlin figure was based on anyone real. I mean, it's not impossible. We just have no way of knowing. Based on the evidence we have, it's a bit like people in, 1,500 years' time looking back on our culture and going, perhaps Spider-Man was real, based on the evidence we've got. But it almost doesn't matter. I think, it's irrelevant whether or not he's a real figure. I think other misconceptions, as you say, relate to the fact that he's a kindly old man. He could be kindly, but he was also very morally ambiguous. You wouldn't want your children being educated by someone who's half devil. But I would say actually misconceptions in that respect don't really matter and don't really bother me that much because he's a fictional character. Any interpretation is valid whether it's a medieval one, whether it's a modern one, whether it radically changes the character of Merlin. I think that's what's so interesting about him. You can have many different types of Merlins, and he just keeps evolving and will probably continue to evolve.
We will make sure listeners to check out the links to Dr. Campbell's books. Among Dr. Campbell's many other writings, you've written The Bristol Merlin, Revealing the Secrets of a Medieval Fragment, and the other book from 2017, The Medieval Merlin Tradition in France and Italy, Prophecy, Paradox, and Translatio. Is there anything that you'd like to share, Dr. Campbell, just about those two books or the many, many other writings that that you've penned regarding Merlin and translation? Anything that you'd like the listeners to know?
Well, my first book's it was my PhD thesis, so it's quite heavy on the academic theoretical side of things. So I would say if you were to get hold of a copy of that, I mean, please wait till it's reduced. Academic books are far too expensive. If you see it in a bargain basement, then I would maybe skip chapter 1, because that one's quite dense. I would maybe read the chapter on Vivienne is a bit more accessible, and the final chapter on the Italian prophecies. But the rest are a little bit boring. Even I think they're a bit boring.
Gotcha. And of course, if people would like a full dive as well on the Bristol fragment, they should check out the Bristol Merlin book as well, which you co-wrote again with Dr. Tether as well as Dr. Pohl.
Yes, and that one's a lot more accessible, I think. And it also contains a translation of the fragment itself. So if you're interested in reading it, the translation in English, you can find it there.
Where else can people find out more about perhaps your upcoming works, your projects, or if they can connect with you on social media? Anything else that you'd like to share?
So you can follow me on Twitter under the Twitter handle Cambiechoo, CAMBIECHOO. And that's where I do most of my work-based social media.
Is there anything else that you'd like to share or anything else that you'd like to add about either the Bristol fragments or Merlin or anything else?
I just want to thank people for listening. I've spent over 10 years with Merlin now. It's become a big part of my life. So it's just really nice that people are interested to hear about it. And, hit me up on Twitter. I'm happy to talk Merlin anytime.
Dr. Laura Campbell, Merlin experts and a part of the team of experts that examined the Bristol fragments. Really appreciate you taking the time, Dr. Campbell. Thank you just so much for stopping by the podcast today.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
Glitch Bottle patrons and listeners, was it just me, or did you also feel pulled into the tributaries of history when Dr. Laura Campbell started sharing about this fascinating figure of Merlin? I also definitely, after chatting with Dr. Campbell, let go of some common misconceptions or wizardry attributes that had nothing to do with the original legend himself. A huge thanks to Dr. Campbell for sharing her time, and also a huge thanks to every Glitch Bottle patron on Patreon. Did I mention Glitch Bottle has no sponsors or advertisements to support it? Literally only listener support is the reason that makes the podcast possible. So if you'd like to claim your rightful seat on the Glitch Bottle caravan and enjoy extra perks and chats, please consider visiting patreon.com/glitchbottle. And you can always listen to Glitch Bottle on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Spreaker.com, and Stitcher Radio. As always, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.